thank you all for coming again. I'm Chuck Offenberger. I'm a board member of the Historical Society. There's one other group that we're partnering with on this besides the Jefferson Public Library, and we've done some nice collaborations with the library, just like Jane said, and we're going to continue to do that in the future on programming and stuff. But Humanities Iowa is also one of our partners on this presentation today. David is a speaker for them around the state, and they have terrific programs available too, and we're really glad to be able to tie into them. There's a couple stories you're going to hear today. You're going to hear one that's the obvious. David Connon's book, Iowa Confederates in the Civil War. He's going to tell the story of the soldiers that are involved in that. I think there's 76 soldiers you found who were in this category, and he's going to tell some of their stories today. And as he finishes each soldier's story, pop your hands up if you have specific questions on that soldier. It'll be a little easier for everybody to keep track of that if we do that then. And then he'll move on to the next one as he's going through the ones he's going to feature. And then again at the end of his presentation, you'll be able to ask questions then too, and stop and visit with him afterwards as he's selling books, and then have the treats over there. The book, incidentally, will be for sale for $26.74 a piece. It's really a bargain at that, when you consider especially the amount of research that's gone into this. And that's the second story I wanted to tell you here today. David has always been interested in history. He's been a presenter at Living History Farms, you know, a costume presenter at Living History Farms over the years. He's been a substitute teacher. As Jane said, he's now working at the West Des Moines Public Library, where one of the reasons he's thrilled to work there is because he can carve out time and get in the stacks and get the books out and do his research while he's working when things are a little slow. But he has basically thrown himself into his love of history and works pretty much full-time as a researcher and writer. He's able to do this with great support from his wife, Melinda Connon, who is a math teacher at Earlham High School and carries the ball financially while she allows her husband to spend lots of times researching old archives and records. When you hear, I'm not going to spoil it, but when you hear how he came upon this story, you'll have new appreciation for what historians do. When something pops up in front of them, and then when they pursue it for basically the next 11 years to get the story that's now in this book. So we really appreciate your time, David, not only to come up here today, but the time you put into history, because you're living this stuff, and we really do appreciate it. We need more people like you who are willing to do this. Let's all welcome David Connon.
Before I begin this presentation, since Chuck, you referred to this, would you like to just hear how I stumbled onto this topic of Confederates from Iowa?
Absolutely.
Okay. It started with learning about the Grinnell station of the Iowa Underground Railroad. And there's a book by Dorothy Schweeder, The Grande Dame of Iowa History. Perhaps you know Dorothy or knew her. And she had an excerpt of a letter of a witness to Grinnell's first riot over the presence of fugitive slaves in the Grinnell Public School. It was right before the Civil War. It fascinated me. I studied that intensively for 6 years. And then I thought, I expanded my research a little bit and learned that in summer of 1864, Iowa had their first draft ever. And they called up 3 men from Poweshiek County who didn't report for duty, so that the provost marshal located in Grinnell, Iowa, right in Poweshiek County, sent 2 deputy marshals to round up the draft deserters. But the problem was, bushwhackers murdered the 2 deputy marshals. That was so shocking that for the first time in my life, I asked myself, is it possible that any Iowans actually served the Confederacy? I thought that was impossible. We all know that Iowa was such a strong pro-Union state, At least approximately 76,500 Iowa men and boys served the Union. It turned out that there were some Iowans who served the Confederacy, and that led me on to, as Chuck suggested, 11 years of research. And so enough of the background. Strong Iowa men standing shoulder to shoulder in the ranks of the Union Army, loyal to a fault. This is a popular picture of our state during the Civil War. The reality is a bit more complicated. I have documented 76 Iowa residents who left our state and served the Confederacy. They entered every branch of the Confederate service, and one Iowa resident is listed on the honor roll, the Confederacy's highest recognition of valor in battle. Those men could be called shadow images or doppelgangers of their Union counterparts. My book is part of a trend that looks at people both in the North and South that fought outside their geographical origin. Historian Richard Nelson Current, author of Lincoln's Loyalists, estimates that 100,000 Southerners fought for the Union. Current calls Southerners who entered the Union Army the forgotten men of the Civil War. Iowa Confederates, I suggest, are the forgotten Iowans of the Civil War. The data shows three main motives for Iowans to serve the Confederacy. Some were interconnected. Most common was opportunism, often related to earning a living with little regard for principles or consequences. Many of these men had moved south in the late 1850s seeking a job during the financial panic of 1857. The Iowans encountered many Southern influences, Southern friends, Southern belles, jobs, bosses, politicians, etc. When war broke out, they wanted a paycheck and they enlisted. It is helpful to remember that many Iowa Confederates were young men who loved adventure. I call the first story, Ramblin' Man, an impatient Iowan in the Confederate Navy. 20-year-old midshipman William H. Wall was grinning the day that he resigned from the U.S. Naval Academy. Dreaming of success in business, he went home to New London, Iowa in 1858. He became a clerk as local businesses failed. Gloomy men walked the streets, and Wall became alarmed. Facing the ugly truth, Wall knew that he had made the mistake of his life. After a year in New London, he tried to regain his place at the Naval Academy. No luck. The vacancy had been filled. Wall went to Mississippi in summer of 1860. Wall quickly made political contacts in Sardis. He enjoyed the full confidence of the entire community in less than a year. In spring 1861, before the war started, local residents asked President Jefferson Davis to appoint Wall a lieutenant in the Confederate Army. The men stated, "You will greatly oblige your friends." But Wall did not wait for an appointment. Instead, he enlisted as sergeant in the 12th Mississippi Infantry. The unit was too late to fight at Bull Run, so they returned to Mississippi. Wall served as adjutant in Colonel Henry Hughes's partisan cavalry. Back in New London, Wall's younger brother Charles, an Iowa native, enlisted in the 6th Iowa Volunteer Infantry. Down in Mississippi, Wall told Confederate Senator G.A. Brown that he was determined to be a career officer. Wall's first choice was a commission in the Army. His second choice, the Navy. He was quickly appointed to serve on the gunboat Atlanta, outside of Savannah, Georgia. The Atlanta's commander, William McBlair, complained, "The lieutenants I have now are from civil life, miserable sticks. I would not give a penny for a quart of them." Wall moved to Charleston, South Carolina, serving 2 years aboard the ironclad Chicora. Next stop, Richmond, Virginia, where Wall commanded the gunboat Drury until Union artillery destroyed her in January 1865, very late in the war. Wall and his superior officer, Captain Charles W. Reed, headed across the shrinking Confederacy for Shreveport, Louisiana. They had a bold plan. They hoped to run the gunboat Webb down the Red River past New Orleans to the Gulf of Mexico to be used as a privateer. The Union Navy controlled the Mississippi River. Federal gunboats lined its banks every 10 to 15 miles. Wall and Reed crossed the river into northern Louisiana and found the Frank Webb, a side-wheel paddle boat docked in Shreveport. They loaded the Webb with firewood and coal and used 190 cotton bales as armor to protect the machinery. The Webb bristled with weapons. A 30-pound Parrott gun, 2 12-pound howitzers, and 5 torpedoes, one of which was projecting from the bow, supported by a long pole. On April 7, 1865, the Webb left Shreveport, northwest Louisiana, chugging toward Alexandria in the center of the state. 2 days later, Lee surrendered at Appomattox. By late April, the future of the Trans-Mississippi Department was in doubt, and Louisiana residents were increasingly demoralized. On April 23rd, under a murky, pre-dawn sky, the Webb shoved off from Alexandria, disguised as a federal boat. Slipping past a squadron of Union vessels below Simmsport, it entered the Mississippi River. The Webb's crew cut telegraph lines as they traveled. Federals identified the Webb as a Confederate outside of Donaldsonville, but she faced no opposition until she approached New Orleans. Raising a U.S. flag, she went full speed ahead, 25 miles per hour, past the city. Dodging cannonballs from Union picket boats, she took 3 minor hits. Pursued by a federal gunboat for 20 miles, the Webb raised the Confederate flag. Practically tasting freedom, the Webb sailed within range of the federal steam sloop Richmond. As the Richmond opened fire, Captain Reed headed back north, but was trapped between the 2 federal vessels. Battered by shells, Captain Reed ran the Webb aground on the east bank of the river. Reed and Wall set the Webb on fire. Captured later that day, April 25th, they were sent to Fort Warren in Boston Harbor. Wall took the oath of allegiance to the U.S. government on June 13th and returned to Mississippi. Thereafter, a Mississippian, Wall married, had children, and worked in business and banking. Would you like to share any comments or questions about William H. Wall?
Storyteller.
I've got one.
Sir.
Did he ever, by any chance, face his brother, who was serving in the Union Army?
That's a great question. In a way, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? I'm not aware that he faced him in wartime. I'm not even aware if they met after the war. It's possible, but in this sense, my research was limited. I didn't have access to that information. Good question, thank you. Anybody else? The next story is a wrinkle in opportunism. I call it a worthy challenge. The explosion rocked the horse. Shying to get away, it dumped James Ramsey Moore onto the ground. Intense back pain took his breath away. Staggering to his feet, James hobbled after his horse, grabbed its reins, and walked back to his unit. Born in 1835, James Ramsey Moore didn't stand out among the 10 children in his strict Presbyterian family. He was a lackluster student at Washington and Jefferson College, where he managed to graduate in 1858. His parents farmed him out to his successful uncle, Dr. Joseph C. Hughes, Dean of the College of Physicians and Surgeons in Keokuk, Iowa, where James enrolled and apprenticed in his uncle's private hospital. Every aspect of this life was new. The grueling studies, ministering to patients amid blood and gore, and even the freedom of being away from home. James finally had a challenge worthy of his sweat and tears, and he began to flourish. Family and friends remarked that James's character rapidly developed, and he became studious, self-reliant, manly, and strong in principle and purpose. Buried deep in his work, James little noticed the political turmoil embroiling the country. He might have stayed in Keokuk and completed his medical degree, but an enticing opportunity appeared. He could practice medicine in Mississippi, where his oldest sister and her husband lived. Around the time of Fort Sumter, James alighted to Natchez, Mississippi, a community known for its intelligence and culture. Putting up his shingle, he examined 3 partially paralyzed patients, a landscaper, a stonemason, and the African-American foreman of a plantation who hadn't responded to other physicians' treatment. But under James's care, they returned to work. This news spread fast. The Mississippi State Hospital hired James, and he encountered diseases new to him. Hungry for knowledge, his supervisor allowed James to take a leave of absence and study at the New Orleans School of Medicine. He needed to learn about diseases fairly prevalent in the South, including malaria, yellow fever, pellagra, and hookworm. While James attended lectures and visited New Orleans hospitals back in Iowa, Governor Samuel J. Kirkwood appointed James's uncle to be the state surgeon general. Dr. Hughes organized and supervised the Army hospitals at Keokuk, which treated as many as 2,000 sick and disabled soldiers at a time. While his uncle cared for Union soldiers up north, the Confederate Army came calling for James. A professor of surgery recommended James as an assistant surgeon, and he enlisted in May 1862 in Connor Battery, 1st Mississippi Artillery. The soldiers appreciated James's professional demeanor. Chief Surgeon Boyd said, "He is a remarkable man, both in professional ability and powers of endurance. If he don't break down, he will have few equals in the Army." His unit went to Grand Gulf on the Mississippi River, where the Union Navy engaged Confederate troops. James mounted a horse, secured his leather medical bag, and headed for the front line. Hearing shouts, James saw a Confederate cannon fire at a Federal gunboat. The gunboat lobbed a shell that exploded near James, throwing him off the horse and onto the ground. Severely bruised on his back, James went to Port Gibson for medical treatment. He moved into a home to recuperate. The bruise turned into a carbuncle, probably infected with Staphylococcus bacteria. The almost non-existent knowledge of germs meant doctors couldn't help him, and the wound festered. Sweating mightily, James unknowingly guzzled contaminated water and contracted typhoid. Headache, lack of energy, and dry coughing led to high fever and gastrointestinal distress. James's oldest sister and her husband tried to comfort him. Bedridden for the 3rd week, James became delirious. The gifted physician couldn't heal himself, and a Presbyterian elder dropped in. In moments of lucidity, James turned to the great physician, asking Jesus to save his soul. Up in Keokuk, his mentor uncle, Dr. Joseph C. Hughes, helped wounded and disabled Union soldiers. Hundreds of miles south, in a shaded room choked with sweltering heat, James Ramsey Moore died on August 1st, 1862. His comrades buried him in an unmarked grave in Natchez. Would you like to share any comments or questions about James Ramsey Moore?
Why the unmarked grave?
Repeat that question.
Why the unmarked grave? That is a great question. That's a probing question. I don't know. Frankly, it never occurred to me to ask. It was wartime, but his sister and brother-in-law were around. Why Why didn't they pay to mark the grave? I don't know.
Maybe this is an appropriate time to ask. In the story of Wall or Moore here, what are your sources of information? What were you finding that would give you shreds of this story?
Well, first of all, the outline of Moore's story was in an alumni book of the Washington and Jefferson College. That kind of laid the overview. But then I did digging into newspaper accounts from Natchez, also records of the College of Physicians and Surgeons in Keokuk, also James Ramsey Moore's Confederate service record that is, it's in the National Archives, but the microfilm and then digitized copy of it is held, of all the Confederate service records, held in the National Archives. There's a copy at fold3.com. It's a subscription site that allows you, I believe you get 2 weeks of a free access to everything they have, but you can get copies of, download copies of Confederate service records, enlistment, medical information, letters, anything that's in the Confederate service records. It's a fascinating source of information. Also census records, very important. In my view, for me it was extremely important to do two things with each of these Iowa Confederates. One, establish Iowa residency, and two, establish that they were an Iowa Confederate. But without getting too deep into the weeds, the question arises, what on earth is an Iowa resident? As far as I could tell, nobody had defined it before, so I thought, I will put my best foot forward, and here's how I defined it. An Iowa resident was someone who, in this context, someone who had lived in Iowa no earlier than 1850, so it's once Iowa was a state, no longer a territory, no earlier than 1850, for at least 2 years, and was 13 or older during residency. Now I picked the year, I picked 13, thinking about General Sullivan Ross, who was born in Iowa but left Iowa with his parents from Van Buren County when he was about 1. But I thought, you know what, a 1-year-old doesn't have any awareness of a state. So I thought, let's say 13-year-old, what people typically think is the onset of puberty, of being a teenager, where there's typically increasing self-awareness and awareness of one's surroundings. I thought at age 13, there was a chance that a person could start to identify with a town, yeah, even a state. And so that's why I picked the age of 13 for Iowa residency. Okay, I didn't mean to go way off on the rails there, off into the weeds, but anybody else?
Sol Ross was a Confederate general.
Yes, he was.
State.
Yes, he was.
Governor of Texas.
Yes, he was. I will mention that, it reminds me, many Confederate leaders actually were aware of Iowa, but I couldn't count these men as Iowa Confederates. For example, when Iowa was still a territory, the federal government sent various troops to Iowa to guard frontier sites and do engineering and scouting, including Robert E. Lee and Jefferson Davis, but no one would ever consider them to be Iowans. So when I chose 1850, we didn't even have to think about those guys. Shall we go to the next story? Okay. Iowa Confederates were shadow images or doppelgangers of their Union counterparts in every way, including stresses faced by married couples. I call this story, Love Will Keep Us Together, or Will It? John and Nancy Shipley had great hopes and dreams on their wedding day. They married amid the gloomy financial panic of 1857. The 25-year-old groom and the 19-year-old bride thought the best was yet to come. John and Nancy left Muscatine, Iowa, and headed for Memphis, Tennessee, a town that was fairly booming. Companies were engaged in construction as well as steamboat manufacturing, repair, and reconditioning. Nancy conceived and came back to Muscatine to deliver their son, William Everett Shipley, born in June 1860. Nancy and the baby rejoined John in Memphis. Nancy felt their marriage was happy and contented. After Lincoln was elected president, John sent Nancy and 5-month-old William back to her parents' home in Muscatine. She supposed it was because of the political troubles. Nancy's parents supported her and the infant. Nancy missed her husband. So she returned to Memphis 5 months later, in April 1861, around the firing upon Fort Sumter. John immediately sent her back to Muscatine, saying she might find it difficult to get back. A few weeks later, John enlisted in the Tennessee Infantry. He stopped sending letters, and he did not send any child support. Nancy's father went down to Confederate-held Tennessee the following spring of 1862. He saw John's manner and action and thought his affections were entirely alienated from his wife and child. His conclusion? John was devoted to the Southern Confederacy. Mutual friends said that John had been promoted. He was now a captain and acting commissary of subsistence, providing food to soldiers. Despite his promotion, he still didn't send money to support Nancy and their son. Of course, in fairness to John, he was paid in Confederate dollars that Nancy couldn't spend. The Muscatine Journal reported on April 18, 1862, that John was in the Confederate Army, but they erroneously said that John had been captured at Island Number 10. The Journal also stated that the 11th Iowa Infantry lost half of their officers at Pittsburgh Landing. Local passions burned against rebels and their families and supporters. The next year, on January 14, 1863, Nancy filed for divorce, claiming desertion and abandonment of her and their child. Her lawyer said that John was serving a nefarious cause. She believed that John had sent her back to Muscatine in order to free himself from his responsibilities and to aid the Confederacy. Nancy obtained a divorce on June 1, 1863, while John was in Shelbyville, Tennessee. She soon married another Muscatine man. John's motives are a mystery. Shipley family tradition implies that John's drinking was a factor in the divorce. 2 years later, Robert E. Lee surrendered, and Jefferson Davis fled Richmond, heading for the Deep South. In the manhunt that ensued, Union Brigadier General W.J. Palmer captured John near Athens, Georgia on May 8, 1865. After the war, John returned to Muscatine and worked as a bookkeeper and insurance salesman. In 1893, almost 30 years after the end of the war, John was elected to one term as Muscatine City Treasurer. Would you like to share any comments or questions about John and Nancy? Yes, ma'am.
It would seem that his fighting with the Confederacy might have been an issue. Did that come up in newspapers or any comments made about him at the time?
That's a great question. The most that I found is that it came up in the divorce proceedings. It's a great question. So that was another source. It was fascinating to read divorce proceedings from during the Civil War. Anybody else? One of every 4 Iowans had a divided family, with a brother or a son in the Union Army. That number seems more appropriate for a border state. Somebody told me, well, you know, Missouri was a border state, and Iowa is a border state of a border state. I call this story The Brothers' War. Dipping his pen into his inkwell, Charles O. Musser, 29th Iowa Infantry, critiqued his big brother, William, a Confederate in a POW camp. The Musser family had moved from Ohio to Pottawatomie County, Iowa by 1853. William A. Musser, born in 1841, was 2 years older than Charles. By 1860, 19-year-old William had a valuable apprenticeship at the Council Bluffs Nonpareil. Charles, in contrast, was an unskilled farm laborer. Charles enlisted in the 29th Iowa Infantry on August 9, 1862. Promoted to sergeant, Charles frequently wrote their father in Council Bluffs, Iowa, about the rigors of a Union soldier's life and the war. Older brother William entered the Confederate service on September 20th, 1862, almost a year and a half after the war began, in Company D, Hunter's Battalion, later known as the 3rd and then the 11th Iowa Infantry. 2 days later, 22-year-old William became a government printer and an army printer in General Thomas C. Hindemann's headquarters. He labored in this position until he was captured in September 1863 in Bolivar County, northwest Mississippi. Federal troops whisked him to Camp Morton POW camp in Indianapolis, Indiana. William had rigors of his own at Camp Morton. The population more than doubled in size after he arrived in September 1863, putting a strain on its cramped hospital. Many prisoners were profusely verminous. A medical inspector stated, "The ratio of mortality is unwarrantably large. This camp is a disgrace." He added that there were not enough latrines, and those that existed were never cleaned. Winter arrived early at Camp Morton. The barracks in November 1863 were unfloored, badly heated, and poorly ventilated. Prisoners kept pouring in, many of whom lacked drawers, socks, and shirts. Prison officials doled out shoddy clothing, including short blue coats that lacked buttons, so no one could mistake prisoners for Union soldiers. Later that month, Charles wrote their father about William. "If it is in your power to help him, do so. I hope he has seen the error of his ways, and he is still my brother, even if he is a rebel." William's life became harder on New Year's Eve as the temperature plunged to 20 degrees below zero. Furious, swirling snow blew through the crevices of dilapidated barracks, huts, and tents. Wood stoves could not cope with the punishing conditions, and sleeping itself was an ordeal. Prisoners typically lay huddled in groups of 3 on long shelves with a little straw and 1 blanket beneath them, and 1 or 2 blankets stretched across all 3 men. Lice and fleas, hardy even in this weather, proliferated. Men with no change of clothing washed their only garments and bathed in teeth-shattering cold. Freezing temperatures pushed many weakened Confederates to their deaths. Charles urged their father on January 17, 1864, to forget about his brother's choice to serve the Confederacy. But the longer that William remained in prison, the more that Charles hardened his own heart toward his brother. On May 20th, 1864, Charles advised, "If he does not relent, let him suffer the penalty of his misdeeds." The Lincoln administration in midsummer cracked down on Confederate prisoners in retaliation for widespread malnutrition in Andersonville Prison in Georgia. Camp Morton officials cut rations and doubled the prison population. When prisoners stepped outside to relieve themselves, they encountered a massive, noxious latrine with swarming mosquitoes. Unbeknownst to them, the mosquitoes carried pestilent malaria. Wells and cisterns dried up during a drought. Sick POWs overflowed the hospital, and no one had enough fruit and vegetables. Hungry men sometimes caught and ate rats. Prisoners took vengeance upon a miserly sutler by eating his dog. Now, compared to William's woes, Charles was having a good summer. He crowed to their father about his good health. In October 1864, Charles was building snug winter quarters. He paused to write their father. Striking a note of patriotic indignation, Charles stated, "Let William suffer the consequences, or let him adjure his traitorous principles and become a man again." William survived the winter and was released on March 14, 1865, after taking an oath of allegiance to the Constitution. He remained in Indianapolis, working as a printer at the Herald and then the Journal, rather than returning to Council Bluffs. Charles wrote and then Charles had another change of heart. He wrote their father on April 1st, 1865, that he wanted to see William, and he hoped he was doing well. But it's doubtful that William was eager to see Charles, given his brother's ire toward Rebs. After the war, William hoped to find joy in his new marriage to an Iowa woman. He wrote their father, "The sufferings and hardships of the war and prison life have left their effects on me. I can never forget the treatment of prisoners at the hands of the federal authorities." In the years after Appomattox, William remained distant from his family, and he ended up living at the Union Printers' Home, a residence for invalid, aged, or infirm printers in Colorado Springs, Colorado. Would you like to share any comments or questions about the Musser brothers?
What did you find out about William's reasons for joining the Confederacy?
I couldn't document it. It seemed plausible. The reason, question, what did you find out about William's motives for serving the Confederacy? And I couldn't really document it. I couldn't nail it down, but it seemed plausible to me that given the circumstances, that he was an opportunist, using the same skills that he used at the Council Bluffs Nonpareil, using it in the Confederate service. I could be wrong on that.
Did they ever meet in a family reunion?
That's a great question. I was not able to locate it, and those letters were found in a transcription of a wider correspondence of letters between Charles and their father, and that author was not able to locate any letters either about saying that they met after the war. So we assume, given the circumstances and the intensity of Charles's feelings about his brother during about his brother's Confederate service, I think it's safe to assume they probably never saw each other after the war. But sometimes these divided families did meet. They did have reunions, and there was reconciliation after the war. It didn't always turn out like this.
Did he ever meet up with his father again?
Ooh, that's a great question. I don't know. There was no indication of this in correspondence or newspaper articles or journal articles that I've been able to find.
David,
Yes,
was it William Musser who was in Council Bluffs at the Nonpareil?
yes.
And then he eventually newspapering in Muscatine too?
No,
Was that Charles who went to Muscatine?
well, Muscatine was with, it was with John Shipley. John and Nancy were in Muscatine. Sorry about that.
But William Musser was the printer,
Yes,
and was the printer for the Confederacy.
yes.
And did I understand correctly that he wound up in a Union facility for indigent printers or whatever?
It was called the Union Printers' Home. The name itself doesn't necessarily mean that it was for Union veterans. It was for veteran printers, for invalid, aged, or infirm printers.
Oh, like union, like labor union.
I think it's more of that idea, or some type of fraternal organization of printers.
Got it.
Great question. Anybody else? All right. The next is the last story, but after I finish the last story, I'll have some final information on other motives for Confederate service. The last story reflects some of the political pressures in wartime Iowa. After all, we're in Iowa. What is our understanding of life during the war unless we all also consider politics? I call this story, Son of Former Iowa Governor Goes Bad. Rebel son becomes campaign issue.
Let's hear it.
Junius L. Hempstead set down the chisel and ran his fingers over the marble contours of the bust. He was reminded that God, on the seventh day, looked at his creation and said it was good, very good. A Dubuque arts patron was so impressed that he offered to send 18-year-old Junius to Europe to study art. But Junius's father, a realist who had been Iowa's second governor, nixed the idea. Insisting that Junius receive a good civil and military education, he tried unsuccessfully to enroll his son at West Point. But then another option appeared. Former Governor Stephen Hempstead and his wife Lavinia, a native of Maryland, would long remember the day that Junius enrolled at Virginia Military Institute 9 months before Fort Sumter. VMI had a good reputation, and Junius did well in class. Governor Hempstead might not have known that being a cadet meant taking an oath to support Virginia against all of her enemies. Junius later explained that he believed in states' rights to the fullest extent and thought every state is a sovereign power privileged to withdraw at will. He quickly identified with Virginia and the Southern cadets. After Virginia seceded, Junius wrote, "Her enemies became mine." Junius and other cadets entered the 5th Virginia Infantry. His service became a campaign issue for his father, who was running for Dubuque County Judge. A newspaper article criticized former Governor Hempstead. The article stated, "Governor Hempstead does not believe in the war to put down rebellion. On the contrary, he believes in the war begun by the South to destroy the government, for he has a son in the rebel army fighting against his country. Who knows but that some of our own citizens may have a relative shot by the hand of this rebel son of a disloyal father." A letter to an editor accused, "That son joined the rebel army and did so with his father's approval." In spite of the uproar, Governor Hempstead was elected county judge. Meanwhile, Junius the artist was becoming a warrior. His superior officers asked Jefferson Davis to give Junius an officer's commission. They described him as a worthy young gentleman and a proficient drill master who acted with bravery and coolness in 2 battles. The officers explained why Junius needed a commission. Mr. Hempstead's father and friends are residents of the state of Iowa, and though Southern in their feelings, are unable to give him any pecuniary assistance, and as it would be unsafe for him to visit them, he is entirely dependent upon himself for a support. Now, Governor Hempstead likely had fond memories of years spent in Missouri as an older teen and a young adult, but he didn't side with the Confederacy. He was a Douglas Democrat, and even Junius admitted that he was a strong Union man. A month after the officers wrote to Jefferson Davis, 2 of Junius's friends, Dubuque friends, visited him in the Army camp. Junius made them feel welcome, and they talked over Iowa matters. Both friends later entered the Confederate service. Junius became a lieutenant in the 5th Virginia Infantry. He was badly wounded in the shoulder at the Second Battle of Manassas. After he recovered, he rejoined his unit. At the Battle of the Wilderness, amid a flurry of bullets, He was wounded and captured. Union authorities moved Junius and hundreds of other Confederate officers to Fort Delaware. All too soon, Junius was tested to the edge of his endurance. Junius and 600 other Confederate officers crowded into the dark hold of a Federal steamer. Seasickness and lack of sanitation bedeviled them for 2 weeks. They arrived at Morris Island outside of Charleston, South Carolina, and entered Fort Gregg. Its cannons were pointed at Charleston and 2 Confederate forts, Sumter and Moultrie. The prisoners were held behind the cannons inside a wooden stockade, 4 men per tent. The POWs were seemingly there because of vengeance. A year earlier, in 1863, Union troops had captured Fort Wagner, further west on Morris Island. They began firing cannons at a civilian neighborhood of Charleston. Some of the shells were incendiary, meant to start fires. Months later, seeking relief, Confederates placed 45 Union officers and 5 generals in the besieged neighborhood. In retaliation, Union Army placed Junius and the 600 other officers in the line of fire of Confederate guns aimed at Fort Wagner. The bombardments began on Junius's second night. He couldn't escape the screaming shells and convulsive, shaking ground. Some nights he was so hungry, he drifted off to sleep. By day, Junius could see Charleston and hear the church bells. Junius poured out his feelings in a journal. He prayed, "Oh God, how long will the misery continue?" Hunger pushed him to eat soup, bean soup full of sand and gravel. The guards stole parcels of food and clothing, but they gave the POWs tobacco. Junius started smoking, grateful for a distraction from his stomach. The next day, September 18th, 1864, Junius wrote, "Heard the bells in Charleston. Made my heart ache to think of it. Within sight of liberty, and still not there. Like Moses running to the promised land. How long will this misery continue?" Feelings poured out of Junius. He wrote 2 days later, "I'm getting so tired of retaliation. It is a mean thing, dishonorable in both governments, to treat prisoners of war the way they do. I am homesick and want to get home so bad." After 42 days, the federal government moved the POWs to Fort Pulaski, off the coast of Savannah, Georgia. Chilly Atlantic winds blew in. Junius couldn't get warm since he had neither blanket nor fire for warmth. Hunger continued to gnaw. His parents were frantic. Judge Hempstead started pulling strings to free their son. He may have asked newly elected Iowa Governor William M. Stone to visit Junius in prison. Fellow POW Captain Henry C. Dickinson wrote in his diary, December 29th, 1864, "Still very cold, men coughing terribly. Yanks signaling from the fort. Governor Stone of Iowa arrives. Sent for Lieutenant Hempstead, 25th Virginia, son of ex-governor of Iowa, and begged him to take the oath. Union Commandant Brown added his persuasions and told him we were to be fed on cornmeal and pickles. Hempstead nobly refused." A month later, on January 27, 1865, Judge Hempstead contacted Charles Mason, a Democrat and former Chief Justice of the Iowa Supreme Court. Judge Hempstead wrote, "Prisoners cannot live long if they are treated in this manner. I will take it as a kindness never to be forgotten if you will use your influence with General Grant and others at Washington to effect his parole, and if that cannot be done, his exchange." Judge Hempstead explained that Junius felt that he had to keep his promise to defend Virginia. Junius thought he would perjure himself, that is, violate his earlier oath before God and man if he swore allegiance to the U.S. Battling hunger and cold in mid-February 1865, Junius wrote President Lincoln. Junius explained his moral predicament and asked Lincoln to be indulgent to the prodigal. Judge Hempstead wrote Charles Mason that Junius believes that he has done nothing wrong and is proud of what he has been able to do in defense of a brave people. Junius's father decided not to push Junius to do anything that his son felt was dishonorable. He is now of age to act for himself. The next month, prisoner Junius wrote, "Dear Father, Fort Delaware, March 12, 1865. After many disappointments and hopes, I have landed once more at this place. I am in a hard scrape, have but one shirt to my name, and that is worn out. I am wearing a friend's underclothing. My suit is getting ragged and is very thin for such weather." Junius asked for clothes and family photographs. "Send the box at once, for I have been naked and cold all winter. But this place is paradise compared with where we came from. You all think I am a trouble. I know." He wrote his mother, "I'm almost naked. My clothing is quite ragged, and I need some badly. Come and see me, please. You have a splendid chance. You can get me out of this hard scrape by using your influence." After President Lincoln's assassination, Judge Hempstead kept trying to free his son. He wrote newly installed President Andrew Johnson. President Lincoln, through his private secretary, wrote to Junius promising him a parole for the war, and had he lived, would have granted it. "My son is very young, was nothing but a boy when the war first commenced. He is tired of the war and is anxious to come home." More than a month after Appomattox, Junius remained in Fort Delaware. By this time, Junius was ready to sign the Oath of Allegiance. His father kept trying to get him released. Judge Hempstead described Junius to Charles Mason as a boy who went into the war without mature consideration and, as he supposed, to defend the state of Virginia. On June 16th, Junius finally signed the Oath of Allegiance. He returned to his parents in Dubuque. While there, he wrote Paul Cantwell, a fellow former POW, "I'm going to write a book, and I'm going to publish to the world the cruelty of the Federals to Confederate prisoners." Junius later explained to Cantwell, "The book will show two sides to the question and open the eyes of a number of sensible men in the North." By that Christmas, 1865, Junius had written some 350 pages in longhand. His manuscript has been lost, but Confederate Veteran Magazine eventually published his article, "How the 600 Officers Fared." Junius thereafter lived in Memphis and then Louisiana, mainly writing poems and novels, often related to VMI and his wartime experiences. Late in life, Junius became president of the Immortal 600 Association. He died on September 16, 1920, in Jennings, Louisiana. Would you like to share any comments or questions about Junius L. Hempstead or his parents? Sir?
I thought God said everything was good on the 6th day, and he rested on the 7th.
Oh, good point. Thank you, sir. Wow, that is a great point. Thank you.
Has
Please.
your research shown any comparison of how the prisoners were treated by both sides? Is it comparable?
Great question. Has my research shown how prisoners were treated by both sides? Was it comparable? What I've discovered is, if you were a prisoner of war for either side during the Civil War, it was awful. Even the best were, it was not a picnic. It was just awful. Some were really, really horrible, but it was degrees of bad, so to speak. Great question. Yes?
I can't even imagine, how was the mail distributed?
Oh, that is a great question. You know, believe it or not, the Confederate Postal Service continued to operate for at least part of the war, and probably the entire war. If you think about it, it seems likely that morale was dependent to a large degree on keeping up that communication, morale, esprit de corps of the soldiers. But I discovered something very interesting. Two of the Iowa Confederates from Dubuque, they had a father who had been arrested, George Wallace Jones, one of Iowa's first U.S. senators, thrown into prison and then released. No charges filed, so they violated his civil liberties. He was released. Thereafter, anytime that he communicated with his sons or with other people, he took pains to have private individuals that he trusted to hand carry letters if they needed to cross enemy lines, or maybe even within the North. So that was done too, carrying letters. But I know it was just a start to answer your question, but that's about the best I can do. Thank you for that. Anybody else? Sir?
George Wallace, what's his last name?
Jones.
Jones.
Yeah.
Was quite pro-slavery.
Yes, he was.
Senator from Iowa.
Yeah, he was quite pro-slavery.
How long did he serve?
In the U.S. Senate?
Yeah.
1848 to 1859. Is the longest serving Democrat from Iowa for 91 years.
Wow.
What's that? Guy Gillette was elected in 1950. And Junius served under Stonewall Jackson.
Yes, he did. He did. That's right.
You spoke of not knowing why brothers didn't, when they were on separate thoughts. Well, there's families with the political same problems now, Democrat, Republican, and it causes family problems. And I think that maybe that was also sort of the way it worked in the Confederacy, and that one thought it was okay and the other one didn't think so.
Yeah, it's possible. One Iowa Confederate from...
Repeat Maryland.
Okay, observation that a parallel to today is that family members, siblings, for example, can disagree politically, and that can cause some tension or distance within a family. And perhaps that also existed political differences amongst divided families of Iowa Confederates. And that's a great point. There was an Iowa Confederate from Keokuk whose brother-in-law, his parents were Democrats, but his brother-in-law became a Republican. And he actually became a Supreme Court justice, a brother-in-law of one of the Iowa Confederates. So we can be sure that, yes, there were political differences within that family. Sir, thank you.
I visited Andersonville 2-3 decades ago, and I read the book, Andersonville in high school, I think. Talked about the water was so limited coming through Andersonville that the runoff of the latrines and the soldiers' barracks was the water the soldiers had. Was that also the way it was in the north for the southern prisoners?
I don't know. I think I think it's advisable to look at this on a prison camp by prison camp basis to get into, to compare specific details like that. Thank you for the question, sir.
About the Anderson prison camp, did you find any in your research, did you read about the artesian well that sprung up when they ran out of water?
Okay, about the...
Saved the prisoners.
Yes, about the Andersonville prison camp. Did I read about the artesian well that sprung up when their other drinking water had dried up, and it ended up saving many prisoners? No, I hadn't. But I did find something interesting. The man who was General John Winder was a Confederate general formerly in the U.S. Army. He was over starting Andersonville Prison and seeing that it was built and administered. His son, William Sidney Winder, was an Iowa Confederate who had worked as a lawyer in Keokuk for a couple of years. And Sidney was also helping his dad to help get the prison up and running. So I thought that was just a little connection there. But no, I hadn't read much about the artesian well. Isn't that a great story that sometimes there are acts of mercy that just happen and they help suffering people.
And they have a sign marking that spot.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. Yes, ma'am.
What age range for the enlistees, or was the draft going on? How old were these young men going into?
Okay, the largest group of Iowa Confederates were between 18 and 22 or 23. There were actually probably 19 to 23, 24. That was the largest group, and then older ones had started to decline. The numbers declined. The United States had its baby steps towards a draft in 1862 with something that President Lincoln signed called the Militia Act, but it wasn't really until 1863 that efforts to draft Union soldiers kicked into high gear. But shortly after the United States was doing this, the Confederacy followed suit, having their own draft. And I'll refer to that in just a couple of minutes. Anybody else? Sir?
Females did serve in the war.
Yes, there were some that snuck in, absolutely.
One is buried in Andersonville,
Okay,
a Union female.
thank you. Sir?
I was curious about the one battle that was fought on the Iowa-Missouri border.
Yeah.
Can you...
Yes, the Battle of Croton, Missouri. He was curious about the battle fought on the Iowa-Missouri border. That is a very interesting story. There was fighting, and reportedly, there was a cannonball that bounced over the Iowa line and maybe even ran into a house. It's just over the Iowa line, but the fighting itself didn't occur on Iowa soil. But that's as close as it came. And there were troops, Confederate troops, that came from northern Missouri as well. Very, very northern Missouri in some cases. Thank you for the question. Anybody else? Yes?
Have you ever made contact with any of the descendants of these Iowa Confederates?
Yes, thank you for asking that. Have I been in touch with any descendants of the Iowa Confederates? Absolutely. That was another source of research for me. Some of them supplied letters or photographs. In one case, one descendant was the great-great-granddaughter of one of the Iowa Confederates, and she wrote a letter of permission to gain his medical records from the insane asylum in Independence, Iowa. Even though he had been dead for 120 years, they still needed to have a descendant give me permission to see his medical records. So she did. She was very gracious. So using Ancestry.com, for example, I considered that a tool to try and gather. I was like a vacuum cleaner, trying to gather up every bit of data I could, hopefully that it could confirm data to confirm other facts and really establish what I wrote about. Anybody else? Well, let me give a few last comments. We've already discussed the most common motive, opportunism. The other motives were familial concerns, often related to loyalty to their birthplace or the birthplace of their father or mother. About half of the Iowa Confederates had this motive. A less common motive was philosophical, involving states' rights related to slavery and/or interpretation of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. About 1/3 of Iowa Confederates had this motive. The least common motive was feeling trapped. That is, feeling peer pressure to enlist or being conscripted. So if an Iowan was down south, let's say had sought a job and managed to stay out of the service during the war, once the Confederates began conscripting troops, some of these Iowans were drafted too. And some of them didn't, they felt trapped by being drafted by the Confederacy. I would like to invite you to visit my blog, Confederates from Iowa, Not to Defend, but to Understand. And if a question occurs to you later on, feel free to jot down my email address, shoot me an email, ask me a question. I'll give it my best shot. Or maybe I could refer you to another reference to try and answer your question. In just a moment, I'll open up the floor for comments and questions. And then afterwards, if you're interested, I would invite you to buy a copy of my book. It is cheaper on Amazon, but you won't get a signed copy on Amazon. All right, comments or questions? Anybody?
I've got a kind of a general one.
Sir?
With all of your research and all of your reading on this, do you have a general observation on how divided the country was? What did you learn about that? How divided it was in 1860? And are we even close to that today?
Okay. The question was, based on my research, do I have some comments on how divided the country was in 1860 before the Civil War started? And if I could comment on today's the state of public discourse in the country, the emotional climate, are we anywhere close? Well, I learned two basic things from my Civil War research. And both sides were participated in this, were guilty of this. Name calling, demonizing opponents escalated. It got worse and worse and worse and worse and worse, and the emotional tensions just got higher and higher. And then, and not just name calling, but drumming up fear of each side towards the other side. So that when John Brown he raided Harper's Ferry and he tried to start a slave rebellion, it scared the bejeebers out of many Southerners who were suddenly worried that they would be murdered in their beds. And what I feel and what I think is that when people get scared enough, they do wacky things. They do things that when they're calm, they would never think of doing. They would think there's another option, there's another way out, but you get scared enough, and sometimes people react that way. That may be a bit simple, but I think that's a shorthand version of what happened with our country. We just decided we can't. It's just, it narrowed down to very few options. Okay. I am loath to make comments about today's. I made it my policy not to comment about today. My blog and my research has all been about the past, trying to understand the past. Now, having said that, we're people. We understand what it means to be a person. And if human nature doesn't change, and I contend it doesn't, that allows us to look at the established facts, combine it with what we know of what it means to be a person, to help us understand the past and understand people of the past. So, at the risk of being called a coward, I'm not going to answer that question. But I just find the past offers much fertile ground for consideration of what it means to be human. Yes?
We don't realize now what it was like then in terms of how people felt about their region or their state. I mean, we think of ourselves now as, well, maybe some of us do, as a country.
Yeah.
But I'm not so sure at that time that was a prevailing feeling. It seemed to me like General Robert E. Lee
Yeah.
deserted or decided not to fight for the North
Yeah.
because he didn't want to fight against his state.
Yeah. Thank you, sir.
That's my
Okay, thank you.
thought.
I'll just try and summarize it. Whereas today it's common for us as patriotic citizens to be patriotic towards our country as opposed to simply our state. Whereas before the Civil War, oftentimes for many people, arguably, there's a state allegiance that was greater than a national allegiance. And yet, Southerners who later rebelled against the United States, they also viewed themselves proudly as grandchildren of the American Revolution. They had dual allegiances, you could say, their states and the United States. And so much of the American Revolution had been fought in the South as well. Allegiances and identity, that's a very interesting question when you consider the Civil War. And how one person can have dual identity. So, I was thankful that on this book cover there's both flags. That question of competing identities for any Iowa Confederates. Anybody else? Thank you, sir. Anybody else?
Have you ever heard of the Battle of the Cowpens?
Yes, in Revolutionary War, Battle of the Cowpens, South Carolina? Or maybe North Carolina, but...
Because my family came from Virginia.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and I have a first cousin that wrote a book, not a book, but just a book, I guess you'd say. A pamphlet.
Yeah.
About our family.
Cool.
And I had a Colonel Jacob Rinker that was on the tombstone, said a true Republican.
Yes, true Republican, absolutely. That reminds me, there were many Southerners who were Unionists. Let's assume that they had allegiances identified with their states, but they were Douglas Democrats. They wanted the Union to survive. But when the Democratic Party was at war with itself and struggling, then all of a sudden they no longer, the Union, support of the Union was not predominant, and the fire-eating secessionists broke away, and these poor Unionists, they faced the question, well, when Southern states have seceded, my allegiance is to the Union, but I live in the South. You know, I'm a person of this state. What do I do? So they faced a real dilemma. And sir, building on what you said, echoing it, maybe that's somewhat reminiscent of the choice facing Robert E. Lee. And so many of these, especially after Lincoln, when he signed the order that said, states, send me 75,000 troops so we can send them south. That's what pushed a lot of these Unionist Southerners over the edge, and they supported the Confederacy and joined the Confederate service. That was it. That was it. Yes?
Did any of the people that you researched, did they have any comments or any thoughts about slavery?
Yes. Comments or thoughts about slavery? Absolutely. Roughly 10% of the Iowa Confederates had been raised in households as children that had one or more slaves held in bondage, human beings held in bondage.
In Iowa?
Two of them were in Iowa. Two sons of George Wallace Jones. You may not know, I didn't know this, it was inconceivable to me. In the 1840 territorial census in Dubuque County, there were 17 human beings listed in bondage in Dubuque County. 3 of them were held by George Wallace Jones. Now reportedly they were all freed within the next 2 or 3 years. But that doesn't fit the common wisdom about Iowa. And it's a very rare exception, okay? But one historian said, that's only because he thought, Robert Dykstra thought that Dubuque residents were the only ones brave enough to say, yep, got a slave right here. And I suspect he might be right. But others, one Iowa Confederate was given a slave by his father during the war, was his manservant. This slave had 2 opportunities that the slave had valuables of his owner and the others of the owner's mess, valuables on his person, and he was behind Union lines. He could have just walked away and said, I'm done, I've got these valuable things, maybe we'll call it even. You know, for my service and servitude, and I'll call it even. But he didn't. He was a very scrupulous man. He made his way back across Union lines to his master, his owner. And then after the war, this man continued working for this Iowa Confederate in Virginia for decades, until the Iowa Confederate died. And the only reason I know about this is, one reason is, the slave wrote a letter to Confederate Veteran magazine talking about his service to this guy. It's when you look at individual relationships, you can find some very interesting things. Sir?
Could you expand a little bit more on our opportunism?
Yes.
That you talked about, because perhaps opportunism was more strongly felt by these people than maybe loyalty to anything else?
Yes,
Repeat that, please.
okay, he's asking if I would expound on the idea of opportunism, that maybe opportunism was more strongly felt as a motive for many Iowa Confederates than the other motives. And I think, and that is a great point. The data, to me, for every soldier, when I looked at the data for each soldier and started compiling, organizing it, opportunism was the most common motive. But it was possible to have more than one motive at the same time, just like more than one allegiance. So a person who was down south, for example, or just wanted to enlist, wanted to be employed, but not for the federal government, but wanted to be employed, get a paycheck, could still have philosophical motives that supported the Confederacy, or could have parents who were from the South, or one parent who was from the South. To me, it was an interesting question to think about. how would an Iowa resident who was down south for a job, what kind of influences would help shape his decision to say, yeah, I'll join the Confederate service? Was it simply a matter of, I'll get a paycheck and this might be a hoot? And I'll bet that was true for a lot of these guys. Nobody really thought, very few, unlike Sherman, thought this war would last for years and be horrible and destructive. And many young men kind of liked the idea of draping themselves in glory and having an adventure. But there were also Southern Friends, Southern Belles, and the newspapers and political exchanges down in the South, and Southern food and the climate, and we're human. We're influenced by things. Did that answer your question, sir?
Yeah, I was just thinking about, in terms of the states at that time, particularly the state of Iowa, because Iowa hadn't been a state very long.
No, that's true. Very young state.
So, and you look at the population of Iowa and where most of the population was. So Iowa itself, now we sing songs about Iowa and how we are loyal to Iowa and all those things. I don't think those things were happening at that particular time in our history.
Right. Iowa was so young, it didn't really have songs sung about it, about being loyal to Iowa and this long tradition of this proud, long history of Iowa and being an Iowan. So, good point. Thank you, sir.
One more question.
Yes, sir.
We'll go to treats and books. Next project, what are you working on? What kind of research are you doing now?
Right now, I'm actually interviewing some Civil War historians. Recently, I interviewed by email Ken Liftoft. He's a fine Iowa historian. He's working on his third book of a trilogy of Iowa and the Civil War. He's a fine historian, tells really good stories in there. So I interviewed him and put it on my blog. Totally unrelated subject is, I have a daughter who's now 21. When she was a kiddo, we went to the Henry Dorling Zoo in Nebraska, and we saw the penguins. And she was fascinated, and I was fascinated. And I made up some stories about a penguin that went to live with a family in Massachusetts, and I'm working on that. I want to turn that into a kid's book. I'm a writer, that's part of me. Thank you all for your attention.